So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah!
What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, the Detroit Lions traveled to Minnesota this weekend to take on their division rival Minnesota Vikings. And unfortunately, in the first divisional matchup of the season, the Detroit Lions fell to the Vikings by a score of 28-24. The Detroit Lions had a very good game in which they led a large majority of that game in the scoring. But unfortunately, at the end of the game, the Vikings were able to make more crucial plays than the Detroit Lions, and the Lions fell to their division foes. But today we're going to take a look at this game. We're going to go back, we're going to look at it, look at the good, look at the bad. We're going to take a look at who played well, who didn't, some of the reasons the Lions may have lost, and whether there are reasons to be concerned for the future or whether there are easy fixes going into Seattle. So, with that being said, let's get right on into taking a look at this Week 3 game versus the Minnesota Vikings. Look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and review Week 3 of Detroit Lions football. Now, starting off with the statistics, Jared Goff led the team in passing yesterday as the starting quarterback, completing 25 of his 41 pass attempts for 277 passing yards, as well as a touchdown and an interception. Jamal Williams led the team with 20 carries yesterday for 87 yards, but did score twice and got in the end zone 2 times for the Lions. Swift was very, very heavily underutilized in this game, partially because of his ankle and partially because of his shoulder injury that unfortunately will likely keep him out until after the bye week, but he got 7 carries for 31 yards and also had 2 receptions for 15, so he had nearly 50 yards on the day. Not a great performance by Swift, but it wasn't like he had zero impact on the game either. Josh Reynolds led the team in receptions and receiving yards with 6 receptions for 96 yards. Amon-Ra St. Brown had 6 receptions for 73 yards, while DJ Chark finally started to produce a little bit early in the game with 3 receptions for 46 yards. The defense had 2 shutout quarters and had 2 quarters where they gave up multiple touchdowns apiece. The difference between the 2 quarters is fairly drastic, right? I think in the first and the third quarter, the Lions started to play pretty well. And then in the second and the fourth quarter, at the end of those halves specifically, the Lions really started to fall apart and they really started to show where they still need to learn how to win those football games. Now, defensively, I didn't think the defense had any real standout stars. The pass rush was subpar, to say subpar at best. I mean, they blitzed a lot last week. The Lions blitzed a lot on Sunday just to get the smallest bit of pressure on Kirk Cousins. It did force some incompletions, only got 1 sack by Alex Anzalone. I'd say the only real standout player on defense was Jeff Okudah, as he was man-marked versus Justin Jefferson the entire day and only allowed 2 receptions for 9 yards on the star wide receiver. Jeff Okudah has been one of the small bright spots of the Detroit Lions defense thus far this season. He has been, I think, easily one of the top 10 corners in the NFL through the first 3 weeks of play. He allowed 0 catches on Devontae Adams, or he allowed 0 catches on Devontae Smith, gave up, I believe, just 1 catch or 2 catches to A.J. Brown for very minimal yardage, gave up very little to Terry McLaurin last week, and gave up absolutely nothing to Justin Jefferson, right? 2 catches for 9 yards is almost 0 in the NFL, and Jeff Okudah was able to do that to arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL. He is very much coming into his own this year and finding a spot as a star number 1 corner. Now, personally, I felt like the Lions played well enough to win this game. I think that the players played well enough. I think that Jared Goff was sharp enough. I think that the running game was good enough. I think that the offensive line blocked well enough. And while none of it was necessarily top tier, I thought it was all good enough to win the football game, right? The defense didn't get a ton of pressure, but when they needed it, they forced incompletions. The defense didn't get a ton of turnovers, but when they needed a big one, they forced a fumble, right? They didn't have a great performance, but I thought they played well enough to where they should have won the game, and they definitely played well enough to be in a position to win the football game when it came down to the final plays. Where I think the Lions really let this game get away from them was the coaching, however. I think that the coaching staff really needs to look at this game and use it as a learning experience, because despite the fact that most of them are in year 2, I think there is still some growing pains left to have. Now, I think Aaron Glenn specifically called a very good defense. I think that his defense played pretty well. I think he dialed up blitzes at the right time. They didn't really get beat over the top that often, right? I'd say, the first touchdown they drove down and, obviously it was a short yardage touchdown to Adam Thielen. It's going to happen, right? They had struggles stopping the run early in the game, but towards the middle and the end, the Vikings were not running very efficiently, right? There was the touchdown run, but for a majority of the second half, it didn't feel like the Vikings were breaking off that many big run plays, especially when Dalvin Cook got contained and unfortunately got injured, right? It seemed like Justin Jefferson, when they went to him, wasn't quite having the day that a lot of people expected him to have. And, you just look at it and despite the Lions losing, right, and despite the Lions maybe giving up that last-minute touchdown for the game, I think as an overall performance, I think the Lions defense played fairly well against a very high-powered Minnesota offense. Now, taking a look at the offensive coaching, I thought Ben Johnson really, for the first time, really struggled as the play caller. I thought early in the game they did very well. I like that they got DJ Chark involved early. Jared Goff got in a rhythm very early and was passing pretty well. The Lions put up points and moved the ball pretty easily within the first 3 quarters of play, but I feel like Ben Johnson just got too conservative. I feel like, they got that 10-point lead. They got to the fourth quarter with said 10-point lead, and Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson kind of got together and they were like, okay, we don't want to turn the ball over. We don't want to put the ball at risk. We don't want to, risk something bad happening that can come back and bite us later in the game, right? So that's where you see a lot of those rushing plays from Jamal Williams. That's where you see some short yardage stuff. That's where you see, it's not necessarily those deep balls that maybe you would like to see. And granted, they did try some deep balls. Granted, they did try some deep passing plays that didn't quite work out in the Detroit Lions' favor. But I just feel like they played very conservative in the fourth quarter on offense. I feel like if they just continued to do what was working, right, continue those intermediate to short passing plays, continue to be aggressive on fourth down, right, if they continue to pound the rock north and south versus going east and west to sideline, I feel like they could have had more success. And I feel like the coaching really could have used a little bit more on Sunday because I thought the players played well enough to win. I didn't think the coaches played to win. I thought the coaches played not to lose, and that's exactly how you lose football games in the NFL. Now, looking at this from an overall spectrum, I do not think this was a bad game for the Detroit Lions. And I don't necessarily even think it was a bad overall game for Dan Campbell. I thought that the coaching staff, I thought that Dan Campbell, I thought that Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn all had their moments as coaches. And I thought for a lot of the game, I thought they were doing a good job. I liked that they were being aggressive on offense. I liked that when it was fourth down and short, they trusted their guys to go get it. I liked a large majority of the play calls on third and fourth down that helped move the chains and get the Lions in scoring position. But I will say there was some key mistakes, right? I think that the fourth down tight end screen to TJ Hawkinson was a poor play call. I thought that the lack of aggressiveness at the end of the game after showing you can be aggressive all game was a mistake on part of Dan Campbell, right? And I'm not saying these were the decisions that ultimately won or lost the game for that sole decision, but all of those little things kind of stacked up and eventually worked their way to being the ultimate cause for the defeat last week. Now, I think these are all very, very fixable, right? I think if your biggest problem on the offensive side was that you got too conservative at the end of the game for your offensive coordinator who's calling his third game as an OC in the NFL, I think that's something you can fix, right? I think you can go back and say, okay, Ben, right, you called good plays here and there. You called, some good concepts. Even early in the game, we were scoring points. We were moving the ball. When it got to this, we got too conservative. Next time you're going to do this. Or next time we're going to look to do this and be more aggressive through the air. It's a fixable thing, right? For Dan Campbell, it's okay, now I know what our kicker is capable of, right? We're 3 games into the season. Our kicker was hit or miss, right? Kicker missed a lot versus the Minnesota Vikings. Now you know if you're in that situation again, probably don't trust the kicker, right? It's a learning experience early in the season, and we're 3 games in. The Lions are 1-2 after a good game versus Philadelphia, a good strong victory versus the Washington Commanders, and now a very strong, hard-fought loss to a potential division winner, right? Minnesota's good enough to win the division, and right now they are winning the division because they're that good of a football team. So the Lions have played two playoff contenders, two teams that very well could and may even will win their division, and their combined points and their combined point differential is -5 against two potential division winners. And the one game that they played versus a team that they should have beaten was a pretty commanding victory over, ironically, the Washington Commanders. Now, I think that the Lions have a good opportunity to bounce back next week. I think that on paper they are better than the Seattle Seahawks. I think that on paper they should beat the Seattle Seahawks, and I think that they will beat the Seattle Seahawks. And we will go into that a little bit more in depth in a few days or in the next video. But just kind of going over the final thoughts from this game. The Lions did not play a bad game. The Lions played a good game. The Lions coached a good game. The players executed a good game plan, but the Lions still need to learn how to win. And I'm not saying that this is something that I'm not saying this is something that is going to be unfixable. I'm not saying that this is something that is necessarily going to plague the Lions all season, but the Lions are still a young football team. Dan Campbell is relatively still a very young head coach. Ben Johnson is a very young offensive coordinator with very little experience. Even Aaron Glenn is only in his second year coaching and calling the defensive plays. They're young and they're learning. They're a young coaching staff. They're a young football team, but they are a talented football team. They need to learn how to win these games, and they will. But it's going to take some time, it's going to take some heartbreaking losses, and it's going to take some very hard to swallow pills before Dan Campbell and the Lions learn how to win those close games versus division rivals. But they will learn. Dan Campbell has shown the ability to improve. Ben Johnson has shown the ability to come up with great game plans called great plays. And if there's anything that he can improve on, it's going to be those late game situations. But those are things that are going to come with experience. Aaron Glenn's defense, again, potentially you could look for a little bit more out of the defense, but they did their part to win the football game. By no means am I giving the Lions excuses here, by the way. I don't think that the Lions are excused from this game. I think this is a game that the Lions should have won in the situation. Right, going in, I thought the Minnesota Vikings were the better team, but given the time, down, distance, and situation, I think the Lions should have won this game. And I don't think there's an excuse for why they lost this game. This game is on to the Detroit Lions, right? Whereas, the Philadelphia Eagles, it was, they're a good team. It's week 1, we're going to learn. Week 2, it was, okay, good commanding victory. We're going to move on to week 3. This week, I think that the Lions have no excuses. Yes, Minnesota's good, but you played better. Yes, Minnesota's good. You are a good football team as well. I think this is the first week where the Lions really have no excuses, and although I'm not necessarily discouraged by the results of this game, I do think that the Lions need to look at themselves in the face and really, really find out what the problem was so that it doesn't happen again. With all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Again, I think it was a fairly encouraging game, heartbreaking loss, very tough pill to swallow, but I do think in the end the Lions will learn from it and they will get better. No excuses for this game, but they have a huge opportunity next week to bounce back, and I think that they will do just that. So with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, and as always, go Lions!